The champagne glass slipped from my fingers, crystal shattering against the marble floor of our Cherry Creek penthouse, as I watched my husband of 8 years walk out the door with his suitcase, his arm wrapped protectively around Dr. Natalie. Riverside. The woman who was supposed to help save our marriage was stealing it instead. What they didn't know, as they disappeared into the Denver sunset, was that I held something far more valuable than Marcus's wandering heart. I held Dr. Riverside's entire career in my hands. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The irony wasn't lost on me as I stood in the wreckage of my living room, watching the elevator doors close on what I thought was my life. 3 hours earlier, I had been Amanda Wells, devoted wife and successful member of the Colorado State Medical Board. Now, I was Amanda Wells, abandoned woman whose husband had chosen his therapist over 8 years of marriage. The cruel twist was that while Marcus thought he was escaping into a new life with Dr. Riverside, he had actually handed me the keys to her professional destruction. I swept up the broken glass with mechanical precision, each shard catching the afternoon light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Denver skyline. This penthouse had been our dream home, purchased during the early years when Marcus's real estate empire was expanding, and my appointment to the state medical board represented the pinnacle of my regulatory career. We had hosted dinner parties. Here, celebrated promotions, planned the future that was now dissolving like sugar in rain. The marriage counseling had been Marcus's idea, presented 6 months ago with the enthusiasm he usually reserved for his latest development project. "Amanda, we need professional help," he had said over breakfast, his tone carrying that particular blend of concern and determination that made him successful in business. "I found someone excellent, Dr. Natalie Riverside. She specializes in couples who've grown apart due to career pressures." I should have recognized the warning signs immediately. The way he already knew her specialty, had researched her background, spoken her name with a familiarity that suggested prior contact. But I was drowning in my own professional responsibilities at the time, overseeing a major investigation into prescription abuse among Colorado physicians, and the idea of outsourcing our marital problems to a professional seemed like efficient time management. Dr. Riverside's office was located in a converted Victorian mansion in central Denver, the kind of building that whispered respectability and old money. When I first met her, she struck me as everything I wasn't. Blonde where I was brunette, soft-spoken where I was direct, therapeutic where I was analytical. She wore flowing scarves and spoke in measured tones about emotional landscapes and relationship architecture. Marcus hung on every word. The sessions followed a predictable pattern. Dr. Riverside would guide us through exercises designed to improve communication, assign homework about rediscovering each other, and schedule follow-up appointments with the regularity of a subscription service. Meanwhile, I noticed Marcus becoming increasingly distant at home, his phone buzzing with messages he claimed were work-related, his schedule filling with mysterious evening commitments. The breakthrough came during our 4th session, when Dr. Riverside suggested individual counseling sessions to complement our couple's work. "Sometimes," she explained, her voice carrying that professional warmth that probably cost $300 an hour, "individuals need space to explore their authentic selves before they can fully commit to relationship healing." I agreed, partly because I genuinely wanted to save my marriage, and partly because my analytical nature was curious about the process. My individual sessions with Dr. Riverside were illuminating, but not in the way she intended. While she probed my relationship with work and success, I found myself studying her methods, her credentials, her approach to boundaries and professional ethics. It was during my 3rd individual session that I noticed the first crack in her professional facade. She asked about my work with unusual specificity, wanting to know about the medical board's oversight procedures, disciplinary processes, and current investigations. When I mentioned the prescription abuse case I was handling, her questions became even more pointed. How did complaints get filed? What evidence was required? How long did investigations typically take? Professional curiosity, I told myself at the time. She was probably dealing with colleagues who had faced disciplinary action, or patients whose previous doctors had been investigated. It wasn't until weeks later that I would understand the real reason for her interest. The marriage counseling continued for 3 months, with Marcus becoming increasingly engaged in the process and increasingly detached from me. He would return from his individual sessions energized and talkative, sharing insights about personal growth and authentic living that sounded suspiciously like Dr. Riverside's vocabulary. Meanwhile, our home life became a series of polite interactions punctuated by his mysterious absences and my growing suspicion that something fundamental had shifted. The revelation came on a Tuesday evening in October. I had returned early from a medical board meeting that had been canceled due to a quorum issue and found Marcus's laptop open on our kitchen counter. The screen displayed an email thread that made my blood freeze in my veins. The messages were between Marcus and Dr. Riverside, but they had nothing to do with therapeutic boundaries or professional relationships. Missing you already, read. One message from Dr. Riverside, time-stamped just 2 hours after our last couples session. Tonight felt so natural, like we were meant to be together. I can't wait until this charade is over and we can start our real life. Marcus's response was even more damning. Amanda suspects nothing. The counseling sessions are perfect cover. She trusts you completely, keeps talking about how professional and ethical you are. If she only knew what we were doing in your office after hours. I stood in my own kitchen, reading evidence of a betrayal so complete that it redefined everything I thought I knew about my life. The marriage counseling wasn't therapy. It was an elaborate deception that allowed my husband and his lover to conduct their affair under the guise of professional help. Every session where I had opened my heart, shared my fears, worked to save my marriage, had been a performance for their benefit. The email thread continued for months, detailing hotel meetings, weekend getaways disguised as professional conferences, and plans for Marcus to leave me once the divorce could be orchestrated to look like mutual decision rather than abandonment. They discussed my schedule, my travel plans, my emotional state, as if I were a problem to be managed rather than a human being whose life they were destroying. But it was the final email in the thread that transformed my devastation into something far more dangerous. Dr. Riverside had written, "The ethics investigation she mentioned is making me nervous. Maybe we should accelerate our timeline. I can't afford any scrutiny right now, especially with the new clinic expansion. Too many financial irregularities that wouldn't survive a formal review." I read that message 3 times before its full implications sank in. Dr. Riverside wasn't just destroying my marriage. She was apparently involved in some form of professional misconduct that she feared would be discovered. The woman who held herself up as an expert in relationships and human behavior was not only conducting an affair with her patient's spouse, but was apparently running her practice in ways that wouldn't withstand ethical scrutiny. I closed the laptop carefully, my mind already shifting from devastated wife to analytical medical board member. For 10 years, I had served on the Colorado State Medical Board, overseeing the licensing and disciplinary processes for physicians and mental health professionals throughout the state. I had seen dozens of cases involving professional misconduct, boundary violations, and ethical breaches. I knew exactly what constituted grounds for investigation, license suspension, and permanent revocation. Dr. Natalie Riverside, in her arrogance and her passion, had handed me something far more valuable than evidence of an affair. She had given me the power to end her career. That night, while Marcus slept peacefully beside me, unaware that his deception had been discovered, I began my own investigation. Using my secure laptop and the database access that came with my board position, I pulled Dr. Riverside's licensing file, her educational records, her malpractice insurance claims, and every complaint that had ever been filed against her. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. Over the past 3 years, there had been 6 complaints filed against Dr. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Riverside, all related to boundary violations or inappropriate relationships with patients or their family members. Each complaint had been dismissed due to insufficient evidence or withdrawn by the complainants after what the files described as private settlements. The amounts of these settlements, when I cross-referenced them with her clinic's financial reports, painted a picture of systematic misconduct covered up with hush money. But it was her patient files that provided the most damning evidence. Using my board access to review random audits, I discovered that Dr. Riverside had been conducting what she called intensive relationship therapy with multiple couples, where the treatment involved extended individual sessions that often occurred outside normal business hours. Her scheduling records showed appointments lasting 3 and 4 hours, billed at premium rates, with notations about breakthrough sessions and accelerated healing protocols. The financial records were even more revealing. Her clinic had been expanding rapidly over the past 2 years, adding satellite offices and expensive equipment that seemed inconsistent with the revenue from standard therapy sessions. The insurance billing showed unusual patterns of coding, with many sessions billed as medical consultations rather than psychological therapy, allowing for higher reimbursement rates that bordered on fraudulent. As I dug deeper into the records, a picture emerged of Dr. Natalie Riverside as a predator who used her position to exploit vulnerable couples. The intensive therapy sessions appeared to be covers for inappropriate relationships, with the expanded clinic serving as a front for inflated billing and insurance fraud. My husband wasn't her first victim. He was simply the latest in a pattern of misconduct that had been hidden behind professional credentials and therapeutic jargon. The investigation consumed my nights for weeks while I maintained the facade of normalcy during the day. I attended medical board meetings, reviewed other cases, and continued to participate in marriage counseling sessions with Marcus and Dr. Riverside, all while building a comprehensive file of evidence against the woman who was destroying my life. During those final counseling sessions, I watched Dr. Riverside with new eyes. Her therapeutic warmth now appeared calculated, her insights seemed scripted, and her concern for our marriage was revealed as professional theater performed for my benefit. She would ask about my emotional state with the same tone she might use to inquire about the weather, all while planning her future with my husband. Marcus, meanwhile, had begun dropping hints about our irreconcilable differences and his need for space to grow. He suggested trial separations and spoke wistfully about finding someone who truly understood him. The groundwork was being laid for the divorce that would free him to be with Dr. Riverside without the messy complications of abandonment or infidelity allegations. 3 weeks after discovering the emails, I received confirmation that my own investigation had uncovered enough evidence to warrant formal action. The financial irregularities alone were sufficient for a full board investigation, and the pattern of boundary violations constituted grounds for emergency license suspension. But I wanted more than professional consequences. I wanted justice that matched the scope of their betrayal. The opportunity came when Marcus announced that he would be attending a real estate conference in Colorado Springs over the weekend, a conference that I quickly determined didn't exist. His real plan, as revealed by intercepted text messages, was a romantic getaway with Dr. Riverside at the Broadmoor Resort, where they intended to celebrate their upcoming freedom and plan their future together. That weekend would mark 8 months since our marriage counseling had begun, and 18 months since their affair had started according to the email evidence I had gathered. It would also be the weekend when Dr. Natalie Riverside discovered that her expertise in human behavior had failed to account for one crucial variable. The quiet, analytical woman she had dismissed as a trusting wife was actually one of the most powerful people in Colorado's medical establishment. As I finalized my preparations for what would be their last weekend together, I reflected on the transformation I had undergone. 3 months earlier, I had been a woman fighting to save her marriage willing to trust a professional and open my heart to healing. Now, I was a strategist preparing to deploy the full power of my position to deliver justice that would be both swift and devastating. The irony was perfect. Dr. Riverside had spent months studying my psychology, analyzing my responses, predicting my behavior, all while conducting an affair with my husband under my nose. But she had made one critical error in her assessment. She had mistaken my professional restraint for personal weakness, my respect for process as inability to take action. On Friday afternoon, as Marcus packed for his fictional conference and Dr. Riverside cleared her schedule for their romantic getaway, I made the phone calls that would set my plan in motion. The Colorado State Medical Board would be conducting an emergency investigation into Dr. Natalie Riverside's practice, beginning Monday morning. The timing was not coincidental. Their weekend of celebration was about to become something very different. And unlike the marriage counseling sessions where I had been the unwitting participant in their deception, this time I would be orchestrating every moment of their downfall. The Colorado State Medical Board occupied 3 floors of a granite building in downtown Denver, its sterile corridors and fluorescent lighting a stark contrast to the drama unfolding in the lives it regulated. Monday morning found me in my corner office, reviewing the preliminary investigation file I had assembled on Dr. Natalie Riverside, while Marcus remained blissfully unaware that his weekend getaway had been the prelude to professional catastrophe. My position on the board had taken a decade to achieve, built through meticulous attention to detail and an unwavering commitment to protecting public safety from medical professionals who abused their positions. The irony that I was now using these same skills to investigate the woman destroying my marriage wasn't lost on me, but it felt like poetic justice wrapped in bureaucratic procedure. Dr. Patricia Moore knocked on my office door at precisely 9 o'clock, her expression carrying the gravity that accompanied serious board business. Patricia had been my mentor when I first joined the board, a former emergency room physician whose career had shifted to regulation after witnessing too many preventable medical errors. Her salt and pepper hair was pulled back in its customary bun, and her reading glasses hung from a chain that had seen decades of difficult decisions. "Amanda, I've reviewed the preliminary materials you sent regarding the Riverside case," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk with the file folder in her hands. "This is potentially explosive. If even half of these allegations can be substantiated, we're looking at multiple violations that could result in permanent license revocation." I nodded, maintaining the professional demeanor that had served me well in countless board meetings while internally savoring the validation that my investigation had uncovered genuine misconduct. The financial irregularities alone warrant immediate attention. The billing patterns suggest systematic fraud that could involve hundreds of thousands of dollars in improper insurance claims. Patricia spread the documents across my desk, her experienced eye scanning the evidence I had meticulously organized over the past month. Bank records showing unusual cash deposits, insurance billing records with suspicious coding patterns, patient scheduling that defied normal therapeutic protocols, and complaint histories that painted a picture of systematic boundary violations. "The complaint patterns are particularly concerning," she continued, pointing to a timeline I had created showing the 6 formal complaints filed against Dr. Riverside over the past 3 years. Each one involves allegations of inappropriate relationships or boundary violations, and each one was resolved through private settlement agreements that included non-disclosure clauses. The non-disclosure agreements had been particularly difficult to uncover, requiring careful cross-referencing of legal filings and financial records to identify the payments made to former patients. The amounts ranged from $15,000 to $45,000, significant enough to suggest that the underlying misconduct was serious enough to warrant substantial hush money. "There's something else," I said, retrieving a separate folder from my desk drawer. "I've identified a pattern in her patient selection that suggests targeted predation. Dr. Riverside appears to specifically market her services to couples experiencing marital difficulties, particularly those involving high-net-worth individuals or professionals in positions of influence. Patricia's eyebrows rose as she reviewed the patient demographic analysis I had compiled. The list read like a directory of Denver's professional elite: attorneys, real estate developers, corporate executives, and medical professionals. All couples, all experiencing marital difficulties, all subjected to Dr. Riverside's intensive therapy protocols that seemed designed to create dependency rather than resolution. How did you first become aware of these issues? Patricia asked, though her tone suggested she suspected the answer involved more than routine oversight. Dr. Riverside has been providing marriage counseling to my husband and me for the past 8 months, I replied, maintaining steady eye contact despite the personal nature of the admission. During that time, I observed practices that seemed inconsistent with standard therapeutic protocols. When I began investigating those concerns in my professional capacity, I discovered the broader pattern of misconduct. It was a carefully constructed truth that omitted the most damaging personal details while establishing my credibility as both an insider observer and a professional investigator. Patricia's expression softened slightly, recognition of the personal cost underlying my professional diligence. I'm sorry, Amanda. This must be incredibly difficult to navigate, given the personal implications, she said with genuine sympathy. But your position creates both an opportunity and a complication. We need to ensure that any investigation is beyond reproach, given your personal involvement. I had anticipated this concern and spent considerable time developing protocols that would insulate the investigation from claims of personal bias or vendetta. I've prepared a recusal framework that removes me from any direct decision-making regarding Dr. Riverside's case while allowing my research and evidence gathering to inform the broader investigation. Caroline Hayes has agreed to serve as the primary case coordinator. Caroline Hayes was a newer board member, a former hospital administrator whose methodical approach to complex cases made her ideal for handling sensitive investigations. Her lack of personal connection to either Dr. Riverside or myself would provide the objectivity necessary to ensure that any disciplinary action would withstand legal challenge. That's appropriate, Patricia agreed. But I want you to continue. Your research role. Your insights into Dr. Riverside's methods could be invaluable in understanding the full scope of her misconduct. Just ensure that all evidence is properly documented and independently verified. The next 2 weeks became a careful balance between maintaining my normal board responsibilities and conducting what amounted to forensic analysis of Dr. Riverside's professional life. I requested and received permission to conduct a comprehensive audit of her practice, ostensibly as part of a broader review of mental health billing practices in the Denver metropolitan area. The audit revealed a financial structure that was both sophisticated and deeply concerning. Dr. Riverside had established multiple business entities related to her practice: the primary clinic, a consultation company for corporate wellness programs, and a training institute for relationship therapy techniques. Money flowed between these entities in ways that obscured the true source of revenue and created tax advantages that bordered on fraudulent. Her patient billing showed unusual patterns that became clearer once I understood her operational methods. Standard therapy sessions were billed at normal rates, but what she termed intensive breakthrough sessions were coded as medical consultations and billed at premium rates typically reserved for psychiatric evaluations or crisis interventions. These sessions often lasted 3 to 4 hours and occurred outside normal business hours, frequently on weekends or evenings. Cross-referencing the intensive session records with her appointment scheduling revealed that these premium-billed sessions corresponded exactly with the periods when complaints had been filed against her. The patients who later accused her of boundary violations had all participated in multiple intensive sessions, suggesting that these extended appointments were when inappropriate conduct typically occurred. The insurance fraud implications were staggering. Over the past 3 years, Dr. Riverside had submitted nearly $2 million in claims for intensive sessions, with approval rates that seemed inconsistent with industry standards. When I contacted several insurance companies as part of the audit, I discovered that many of the approved claims had been processed using outdated verification systems that didn't flag unusual billing patterns. But it was the corporate wellness consulting that revealed the most sophisticated aspect of her operation. Dr. Riverside had contracted with several major Denver corporations to provide relationship counseling services for executives and their spouses, billing these services as stress management and productivity enhancement programs. The corporate clients paid premium rates for what they believed were cutting-edge therapeutic interventions, while Dr. Riverside used these contracts to access high-net-worth couples experiencing marital difficulties. The pattern was brilliant in its simplicity. Corporate executives facing marital problems would be referred to Dr. Riverside through their company's wellness program, creating an initial relationship that seemed professionally endorsed. Once engaged in therapy, couples would be encouraged to participate in intensive sessions designed to accelerate their healing process. These sessions became opportunities for Dr. Riverside to identify vulnerable individuals and cultivate inappropriate relationships. My investigation revealed that at least 12 of her current and former patients had been accessed through corporate wellness contracts, and 8 of those cases had resulted in either formal complaints or private settlements. The corporate clients were unknowingly funding a system that allowed Dr. Riverside to prey on their executives while generating substantial revenue through fraudulent billing practices. The evidence was overwhelming, but I knew that successful prosecution would require more than financial records and complaint patterns. The board would need testimony from victims willing to break their non-disclosure agreements, documentation of specific therapeutic misconduct, and evidence that Dr. Riverside had deliberately violated professional boundaries rather than simply maintaining poor business practices. This requirement led me to the most challenging aspect of my investigation: contacting Dr. Riverside's former patients who had filed complaints. The non-disclosure agreements they had signed prohibited them from discussing their experiences publicly, but they didn't prevent them from cooperating with official regulatory investigations. Reaching out to these individuals required delicate navigation of legal and ethical boundaries, but their stories were essential to building a comprehensive case. The first former patient I contacted was Jennifer Walsh, a marketing executive whose complaint had been filed 18 months earlier and resolved through a $30,000 settlement. Jennifer agreed to meet me at a coffee shop in Boulder, far from Denver's professional circles where our conversation might be observed or reported. Jennifer's story followed the familiar pattern I had identified in Dr. Riverside's methods. She and her husband had been referred to Dr. Riverside through their company's executive wellness program after experiencing marital difficulties related to career pressures and communication breakdowns. The initial couple's sessions had seemed productive, with Dr. Riverside demonstrating apparent expertise in relationship dynamics and conflict resolution. She seemed so professional at first, Jennifer explained, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup as if seeking warmth against difficult memories. She understood our problems in ways that other counselors hadn't, and she made us feel like our marriage was worth fighting for. That's what made the later violations so devastating. The intensive sessions had begun after 6 weeks of regular couples therapy, presented as an opportunity for accelerated healing through extended individual work. Jennifer's sessions with Dr. Riverside gradually shifted from professional therapy to personal conversation, with boundaries becoming increasingly blurred as Dr. Riverside shared details about her own relationships and encouraged Jennifer to view their therapeutic relationship as a deep friendship. She started inviting me to have coffee after sessions, then to attend events at her clinic that she said would help me understand relationship dynamics better, Jennifer continued. By the time I realized that our relationship had become inappropriate, I was emotionally dependent on her approval and afraid to challenge her methods. The inappropriate relationship had culminated in Dr. Riverside encouraging Jennifer to leave her husband and move in with her as part of what she called therapeutic independence training. When Jennifer refused and attempted to terminate therapy, Dr. Riverside had threatened to file reports with Jennifer's employer, claiming that she was mentally unstable and required continued supervision. The settlement was the only way to make it stop, Jennifer said, her voice barely audible. She had documentation of everything I had told her in therapy, and she threatened to use it against me professionally if I didn't accept her terms and sign the non-disclosure agreement. Jennifer's story was corroborated by similar accounts from 3 other former patients I was able to contact. Each described a pattern of boundary violations that began with extended therapy sessions and evolved into inappropriate personal relationships. Dr. Riverside appeared to target individuals experiencing emotional vulnerability, using her professional authority to create dependency relationships that served her personal and financial interests. The testimonies painted a picture of systematic predation that went far beyond the affair with my husband. Dr. Riverside was operating what amounted to a sophisticated scheme that used legitimate therapeutic credentials to access vulnerable individuals, exploit their emotional difficulties for personal gain, and silence victims through legal intimidation and financial settlements. Armed with this comprehensive evidence, I prepared the formal complaint that would trigger the Colorado State Medical Board's official investigation into Dr. Natalie Riverside's practice. The document ran 47 pages and included financial records, patient testimonies, billing irregularities, and a detailed analysis of her professional conduct spanning 3 years. The timing of the complaint filing was carefully calculated. Marcus's fictional real estate conference was scheduled to begin on Friday, meaning that Dr. Riverside would be away from her practice over the weekend, unaware that her professional world was about to collapse. The board would receive and process the complaint on Monday morning, with preliminary review completed by Tuesday and formal charges filed by Wednesday. Dr. Riverside would return from her romantic getaway to find that her medical license had been suspended pending investigation, her clinic accounts frozen, and her patients transferred to other providers. The corporate wellness contracts would be terminated immediately upon notification of the disciplinary action, and the insurance companies would begin their own fraud investigations based on the evidence I had provided. But the professional consequences, devastating as they would be, were only the beginning of what I had planned for Dr. Natalie Riverside. The woman who had spent months manipulating my marriage while conducting an affair with my husband was about to discover that her expertise in human behavior had failed to account for one crucial variable: the methodical vengeance of a woman who had been underestimated. Friday afternoon arrived with the precision of clockwork. Marcus kissed me goodbye with the casual affection of a man who believed his deception remained undetected, his suitcase packed for a weekend that would mark the beginning of his new life. Dr. Riverside, according to the clinic scheduling system I had access to through the board's oversight database, had cleared her appointments and left explicit instructions that she was not to be disturbed except for genuine emergencies. As their car pulled away from our Cherry Creek penthouse, heading toward what they believed would be a celebration of their future together, I made the final phone call that would set my plan in motion. Caroline Hayes answered on the first ring, her voice carrying the efficiency that made her an excellent case coordinator. "Amanda, are you certain you want to proceed with the emergency filing?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew my answer. "Once we submit this complaint, there's no returning to the status quo. The investigation will be public record, and the consequences will be permanent." "I'm certain," I replied, looking out at the Denver skyline where my husband and his lover were beginning their final weekend of freedom. Dr. Riverside has built her career on exploiting people who trusted her with their most vulnerable moments. It's time she faced the consequences of that choice. The complaint was filed electronically at 4:47 p.m. on Friday afternoon, triggering automatic notifications to the State Insurance Commission, the Colorado Attorney General's Office, and the federal agencies responsible for investigating healthcare fraud. By Monday morning, Dr. Natalie Riverside's professional life would be under siege from multiple regulatory bodies, and her personal life would be complicated by the criminal investigation that would inevitably follow. But first, she would have Her weekend at the Broadmoor Resort, blissfully unaware that every moment of happiness she shared with my husband was being purchased with the destruction of everything she had worked to build. The irony was perfect. The woman who specialized in analyzing human behavior was about to experience the consequences of fundamentally misunderstanding the person she had chosen to betray. The Broadmoor Resort sprawled across the foothills of Colorado Springs like a golden palace, its Victorian architecture and manicured gardens providing the perfect backdrop for what Marcus and Dr. Riverside believed would be their triumphant weekend celebration. What they couldn't know, as they checked into their suite under assumed names, was that their romantic getaway was about to become the stage for a carefully orchestrated revelation that would destroy both their future and Dr. Riverside's career. I had driven down from Denver on Saturday morning, taking the scenic route through the mountains while reviewing the final details of my plan. The timing had to be perfect. The Colorado State Medical Board's emergency investigation would begin Monday morning with Dr. Riverside's license suspension, but I wanted her to understand the scope of her downfall before the official machinery of justice began its work. This weekend would be her last moments of freedom, and I intended to make them memorable. The resort's lobby buzzed with the quiet elegance of wealth and privilege, crystal chandeliers casting warm light over marble floors while guests moved with the unhurried confidence of people accustomed to luxury. I had reserved a corner table in the main restaurant, positioned to provide clear sightlines to the entrance while remaining inconspicuous among the other diners. My appearance had been carefully calculated: designer dress that projected authority, jewelry that suggested success, and the kind of understated confidence that came from holding all the cards in a game my opponents didn't know they were playing. Marcus and Dr. Riverside made their entrance at precisely 7:30, dressed for an evening that represented everything they had been planning during their months of deception. Marcus wore the charcoal suit I had given him for our 5th anniversary, while Dr. Riverside had chosen a flowing burgundy dress that emphasized her theatrical sense of romance. They moved with the easy intimacy of lovers who believed their secret was safe, their body language speaking of shared confidences and future plans. Watching them together, I felt the final pieces of my emotional armor click into place. The pain of betrayal had transformed into something far more dangerous. The cold satisfaction of someone who had turned personal devastation into strategic advantage. They had spent months analyzing my psychology, predicting my reactions, planning their escape from my marriage. Now, I would demonstrate that their understanding of human behavior had critical blind spots. The restaurant's atmosphere provided perfect cover for observation. The soft murmur of conversation, the gentle clink of silverware against china, the subtle lighting that created pockets of intimacy throughout the dining room. I watched them order wine, saw Dr. Riverside lean across the table to touch Marcus's hand, observed the way he smiled at her with the enthusiasm he had once reserved for me. They were performing their love story for an audience of one, unaware that their most important spectator was taking notes. Dr. Riverside's phone buzzed twice during their appetizer course, messages she glanced at and dismissed with the casual confidence of someone whose professional life was running smoothly. Those messages, I knew, were probably from her clinic's answering service, routine communications that gave no hint of the regulatory storm-gathering momentum in Denver. By Monday morning, her phone would be ringing constantly with calls from lawyers, insurance investigators, and panicked corporate clients. But tonight, she was just a woman celebrating her romantic triumph. Their conversation, overheard in fragments as I dined alone at my strategically positioned table, revealed the depth of their planning and the casual cruelty of their perspective on my marriage. Marcus spoke about Amanda's workaholic tendencies and how our relationship had become more like a business partnership than a marriage. Dr. Riverside nodded sympathetically, offering insights about my emotional unavailability and inability to prioritize personal relationships over professional achievement. The irony was devastating. They were discussing my character flaws while conducting an affair that had been hidden behind the facade of marriage counseling. analyzing my emotional limitations while betraying the trust I had placed in both of them. Dr. Riverside, in particular, demonstrated a chilling ability to compartmentalize her professional ethics, speaking about my psychological profile as if I were a case study rather than the woman whose marriage she had deliberately destroyed. "She's so focused on control and regulation," Dr. Riverside said, her voice carrying the authoritative tone I had grown to recognize during our therapy sessions. "Amanda needs everything documented and categorized. She can't handle the organic, unpredictable nature of authentic human connection. That's why our relationship felt so natural, Marcus. You were starving for genuine emotional intimacy." Marcus nodded eagerly, accepting this analysis of our marriage with the enthusiasm of someone who had found professional validation for his personal choices. "Exactly. Amanda approaches everything like a legal brief. Even our conversations feel like depositions sometimes. She wants evidence and documentation for every feeling." Their casual dissection of my personality continued through the main course, each critique building their justification for the affair, while revealing how thoroughly they had convinced themselves that their betrayal was actually a form of liberation. Dr. Riverside positioned herself as Marcus's emotional savior, the therapeutic professional who had recognized his authentic needs and courageously provided the connection he deserved. "The marriage counseling was actually perfect," Dr. Riverside continued, twirling her wine glass as she spoke. "It gave us a legitimate framework for spending time together while helping you process your feelings about the relationship. Amanda never suspected anything because she trusted my professional credentials so completely. She actually thanked me last week for helping her understand your emotional needs better." The memory of that conversation hit me like a physical blow. I had indeed thanked Dr. Riverside for her insights, expressing gratitude for her patience with our marital difficulties and her skill in helping us communicate more effectively. She had accepted my thanks with professional warmth, all while planning the weekend getaway that would mark her transition from therapist to replacement wife. Marcus raised his wine glass in a toast, his face glowing with the satisfaction of someone who believed he had successfully orchestrated a complex life transition. "To new beginnings," he said, clinking his glass against Dr. Riverside's, "and to the most brilliant woman I've ever known, who showed me what authentic love actually feels like." They drank to their future while I sat 20 feet away, invisible, in my corner table, documenting their celebration for purposes they couldn't imagine. The recording device in my purse captured every word, creating evidence that would demonstrate the premeditated nature of their relationship and the calculated way they had used marriage counseling as cover for their affair. The dinner concluded, with plans for their Sunday morning when they would check out of the resort and begin the process of transitioning their relationship from secret affair to public romance. Marcus would return to Denver and begin the conversation about our irreconcilable differences, while Dr. Riverside would start the process of referring our ongoing counseling to another therapist, citing a schedule conflict that prevented her from continuing our sessions. They had thought of everything, or so they believed. Their plan accounted for my expected emotional reactions, the practical details of divorce proceedings, and even the professional ethics that would require Dr. Riverside to terminate our therapeutic relationship once her involvement with Marcus became public. What they hadn't accounted for was the possibility that I already knew about their affair and had spent months preparing consequences that would extend far beyond personal betrayal. As they left the restaurant hand in hand, heading toward an evening that represented the culmination of their romantic deception, I made the phone call that would transform their celebration into something entirely different. Caroline Hayes answered, immediately, her voice crisp with the efficiency that made her an excellent case coordinator. "Amanda, are you ready to proceed with Phase 2? She asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "They're exactly where we expected them to be," I replied, watching Marcus and Dr. Riverside disappear into the elevator that would carry them to their suite. Confident, celebrating, completely unaware that their world is about to change. Initiate the Sunday morning protocol. The Sunday morning protocol was the culmination of weeks of careful coordination between the medical board, the state insurance, commission, and the federal agencies investigating healthcare fraud. Dr. Riverside would receive a phone call at 8 o'clock Sunday morning, just as she and Marcus were beginning what they thought would be a leisurely breakfast before their drive back to Denver. The call would inform her that her medical license had been suspended pending investigation, her clinic accounts frozen, and her patients transferred to emergency coverage. But the professional catastrophe was only the beginning. The federal investigation into insurance fraud would be announced Monday morning, followed by criminal charges that could result in substantial prison time. The corporate wellness contracts would be terminated immediately, triggering financial audits that would reveal the full scope of her fraudulent billing practices. By Tuesday, Dr. Natalie Riverside would be facing professional ruin, criminal prosecution, and financial destruction that would take years to resolve. The personal consequences for Marcus would be equally devastating, though different in nature. The divorce proceedings I would initiate Monday afternoon would include evidence of his affair, testimony about the deceptive use of marriage counseling, and financial discovery that would reveal how much of our marital assets he had spent on his relationship with Dr. Riverside. The prenuptial agreement he had dismissed as unnecessary would become the legal framework that protected my individual assets while leaving him responsible for the debts incurred during his deception. Sunday morning arrived with the crystalline clarity of a Colorado mountain day, sunshine streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my own hotel room as I prepared for the conversation that would mark the beginning of their new reality. I had chosen a suite on the same floor as Marcus and Dr. Riverside, close enough to observe their reactions, but far enough to avoid accidental encounters before the crucial moment. At 8 o'clock precisely, Dr. Riverside's phone rang in their room, the sound audible through the thin walls that separated our suites. The conversation that followed was one-sided from my perspective, but Dr. Riverside's increasingly agitated voice provided clear indication that she was receiving news that shattered her weekend celebration. "What do you mean suspended? There must be some mistake. I haven't received any formal complaints." Her voice rose with each sentence, panic replacing the confident authority I had grown accustomed to during our therapy sessions. "This is impossible. I demand to speak with someone in authority immediately." The phone call lasted nearly 15 minutes, during which Dr. Riverside's protests became increasingly desperate, and Marcus's voice joined the conversation with questions that revealed his growing awareness that their romantic weekend had become something entirely different. The sound of hurried packing followed, luggage being hastily assembled as they prepared for an emergency return to Denver. I waited until they had loaded their car and begun the drive back to the city before making my own departure, taking a different route that would ensure our paths didn't cross during the journey home. The timing was crucial. They needed to arrive in Denver ahead of me, to experience the full scope of their professional and personal catastrophe before I made my own dramatic appearance. The drive back to Denver provided time for reflection on the transformation I had undergone over the past months. The woman who had entered marriage counseling 8 months earlier, desperate to save her relationship and willing to trust a professional stranger with her most intimate secrets, had evolved into someone far more dangerous, a strategic thinker who had turned personal betrayal into professional weapon. Dr. Riverside had spent our therapy sessions analyzing my psychology, documenting my responses, predicting my behavior based on her professional training and personal observations. But her analysis had contained a fundamental flaw. She had mistaken my respect for process and professional boundaries as evidence of passivity, my willingness to work within systems as inability to manipulate those same systems for my own purposes. The truth was that my decade of service on the Colorado State Medical Board had taught me exactly how regulatory systems worked, where their pressure points were located, and how to deploy them with maximum effectiveness. Dr. Riverside's expertise was in human behavior, but mine was in institutional power, and she had underestimated both my access to that power and my willingness to use it when sufficiently motivated. By Sunday afternoon, as I drove through the foothills, approaching Denver, Dr. Riverside would be discovering that her clinic had been sealed pending investigation, her patients transferred to emergency coverage, and her professional reputation destroyed beyond repair. The corporate wellness contracts that had provided access to high-net-worth couples would be terminated immediately, creating financial chaos that would compound her legal difficulties. Marcus would be learning that his romantic triumph had become a professional liability, his association with Dr. Riverside now a matter of public record that would complicate his own business relationships. The real estate development company he had built over 15 years would face scrutiny from clients and partners who questioned his judgment and reliability. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come. Neither Marcus nor Dr. Riverside understood that I had been documenting their affair for months, collecting evidence that would transform their romantic narrative into criminal conspiracy. The marriage counseling sessions they had used as cover for their relationship would become evidence of professional misconduct, while the weekend getaway they had planned as celebration would be remembered as the moment their carefully constructed deception began its spectacular collapse. As I approached the Denver city limits, the setting sun painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, I felt the quiet satisfaction of someone who had transformed victimhood into victory through careful planning and patient execution. Dr. Natalie Riverside had spent months studying my psychology, but she had failed to understand the most important aspect of my character. When sufficiently motivated, I was capable of sustained, methodical, and utterly devastating response to betrayal. Their weekend of celebration was ending, but my campaign for justice was just beginning. Monday morning would bring the full weight of institutional power to bear on Dr. Riverside's career, while the personal consequences for both her and Marcus would unfold with the inexorable logic of well-planned revenge. They had underestimated the quiet woman they had betrayed, and that miscalculation would define the rest of their lives. Monday morning descended upon Denver with the crisp clarity of an autumn day that would be remembered by everyone involved. As the moment when carefully constructed lies finally collapsed under the weight of institutional justice, the Colorado State Medical Board building hummed with unusual activity as Caroline Hayes coordinated the emergency response protocols that would systematically dismantle Dr. Natalie Riverside's professional life while I watched from my office window, observing the machinery of regulation deploy with precision that reflected months of meticulous preparation. The first phone call came at exactly 8:15 from Dr. Riverside herself, her voice a mixture of rage and desperation that carried clearly through my office speaker as Caroline transferred the call to demonstrate the effectiveness of our coordinated response. "This is absolutely outrageous," Dr. Riverside declared, her therapeutic composure completely abandoned in favor of raw panic. "I demand to know who filed these ridiculous allegations and what supposed evidence supports this witch hunt against my practice." Caroline's response was a masterpiece of professional restraint, delivering devastating information with the calm efficiency that made her an excellent case coordinator. "Dr. Riverside, the complaint includes 47 pages of documented evidence spanning 3 years of practice irregularities, including financial fraud, patient boundary violations, and systematic billing manipulation. The investigation has been referred to multiple agencies including the State Insurance Commission and Federal Healthcare Fraud Division." The silence that followed this announcement stretched for nearly 30 seconds before Dr. Riverside found her voice again, though the confident authority she had maintained during our marriage counseling sessions had been replaced by something approaching hysteria. "This is impossible. Someone is targeting me personally. I want to know who has access to my files and how they obtained confidential patient information. All evidence was obtained through proper regulatory channels by authorized board personnel," Caroline replied with the precision of someone who had anticipated every possible challenge to our investigation. "Your license suspension is effective immediately, and all patient care responsibilities have been transferred to emergency coverage providers approved by the board. The call ended abruptly as Dr. Riverside apparently realized that her protests were accomplishing nothing beyond demonstrating her emotional instability. Within minutes, my phone began ringing with calls from other board members who had been briefed on the emergency action, but wanted to understand the scope and implications of what promised to be one of the most significant disciplinary cases in Colorado's recent history. Dr. Patricia Moore arrived at my office before 9 o'clock, her expression carrying the gravity that accompanied cases involving serious professional misconduct. "Amanda, the media inquiries are already beginning," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk with a folder containing the preliminary press response we had prepared. Channel 7 called asking about the license suspension, and the Denver Post is requesting comment on what they're calling a major healthcare fraud investigation. The media attention had been anticipated and carefully planned for, part of ensuring that Dr. Riverside's professional destruction would be both thorough and public. Our response should emphasize the board's commitment to patient protection and professional accountability, I replied, reviewing the talking points we had developed. The investigation speaks for itself in terms of scope and seriousness. Patricia nodded, though her expression suggested concern about the broader implications of the case. The federal agencies are moving faster than usual. Apparently, the evidence you provided has triggered investigations beyond just Dr. Riverside's practice. The insurance fraud patterns suggest coordination with other providers, and the billing irregularities may implicate several corporate wellness programs. This development exceeded even my most optimistic projections for the case's impact. What had begun as personal revenge against the woman who had destroyed my marriage was expanding into a broader investigation that could expose systematic healthcare fraud across multiple practices and corporate programs. Dr. Riverside's downfall was becoming the catalyst for reforms that would protect countless other potential victims. The morning continued with a series of phone calls that painted an increasingly dire picture of Dr. Riverside's situation. Her clinic's bank accounts had been frozen pending federal investigation, forcing her to immediately terminate all employees and cancel ongoing treatment programs. The corporate wellness contracts that had provided the majority of her revenue were being reviewed for possible fraud, with several companies already announcing suspension of their relationships with her practice. Most significantly, the non-disclosure. Agreements that had silenced her previous victims were being challenged by federal prosecutors as potential obstruction of justice. The former patients who had received settlement payments were being contacted by investigators and offered immunity in exchange for testimony about their experiences with Dr. Riverside's boundary violations and inappropriate conduct. At 10:30, my personal phone rang with a call from Marcus, his voice carrying a confusion that suggested he was only beginning to understand the scope of what was happening to his lover and his own life. "Amanda, I need to ask you something directly," he said without preamble. "Did you have anything to do with what's happening to Natalie?" The question I had been anticipating for months had finally arrived, though Marcus's tone suggested he was hoping for reassurance rather than expecting confirmation of his worst fears. "What's happening to Dr. Riverside is the result of a professional investigation into serious misconduct," I replied with the same calm authority I had maintained throughout our marriage counseling sessions. The Colorado State Medical Board takes patient protection very seriously. "That's not what I'm asking, Amanda. I know you serve on the medical board. I know you have access to information and influence. Did you orchestrate this investigation? Because you found out about us?" His voice cracked slightly on the final words, revealing the emotional pressure he was experiencing as his romantic triumph transformed into professional catastrophe. The moment of truth had arrived, the conversation that would forever alter the dynamic between us and establish the new reality of our relationship. "Marcus, I've known about your affair with Dr. Riverside for 3 months," I said, allowing the full weight of that revelation to settle before continuing. "I've also known about her systematic fraud, her boundary violations with other patients, and her use of marriage counseling as cover for inappropriate relationships. The silence that followed was profound, the sound of someone's worldview collapsing as they realized the extent to which they had been outmaneuvered by someone they had underestimated. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "You've known for 3 months? But you kept coming to counseling sessions. You kept pretending everything was normal." "I kept documenting everything," I corrected, my tone carrying the authority that came from holding all the advantages in a conversation. Every session where Dr. Riverside analyzed my psychology while conducting an affair with my husband. Every therapeutic insight she offered while violating every professional boundary that exists to protect patients. Every moment when you both discussed my emotional limitations while betraying the trust I had placed in both of you. Marcus's breathing became audible through the phone, the sound of someone processing information that redefined everything. They thought they understood about their situation. "What do you want from me, Amanda? What happens now?" The question revealed the fundamental shift in power that had occurred between us. 3 months earlier, Marcus had been the husband planning his escape from our marriage, confident in his ability to manage the transition and control the narrative. Now he was asking what I wanted, recognizing that his future depended on my decisions rather than his own plans. "What I want is for you to understand that actions have consequences," I replied, looking out my office window at the Denver skyline where Dr. Riverside was presumably dealing with the collapse of her professional life. Dr. Riverside used her position to exploit vulnerable people, including both of us in different ways. The investigation will ensure that she faces appropriate consequences for those choices. "But what about us? What about our marriage?" Marcus asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer to those questions. "Our marriage ended the moment you decided to conduct an affair with our therapist," I said with finality that left no room for negotiation or reconciliation. "The divorce papers will be filed this afternoon. Given the circumstances, I don't think you'll find the settlement terms particularly favorable." The call ended with Marcus's whispered acknowledgement that he understood the new reality of his situation. Within hours, he would discover that the prenuptial agreement he had dismissed as unnecessary would become the legal framework that protected my assets while leaving him responsible for the debts incurred during his deception, including the legal fees that would be required to defend against potential criminal charges related to his knowledge of Dr. Riverside's fraudulent practices. The afternoon brought a steady stream of developments that demonstrated the expanding scope of the investigation. Dr. Riverside now faced. Federal agents had executed search warrants at her clinic and personal residence, seizing computers, financial records, and patient files that would provide evidence for both civil and criminal prosecutions. The State Insurance Commission had announced a broader investigation into therapeutic billing practices, using Dr. Riverside's case as the foundation for examining industry-wide fraud patterns. Most satisfying was the response from Dr. Riverside's former victims, who were finally free to speak publicly about their experiences, now that the non-disclosure agreements were being challenged as potential criminal obstruction. Jennifer Walsh, the marketing executive whose story had provided crucial corroboration for my investigation, appeared on the local evening news to describe her experience with Dr. Riverside's boundary violations and inappropriate conduct. She created an environment where patients became emotionally dependent on her approval, Jennifer explained to the television reporter, her voice steady with the confidence that came from finally being able to tell her story publicly. The therapy sessions were designed to break down normal boundaries and create relationships that served her personal and financial interests rather than patient welfare. The news coverage expanded throughout the evening as more former patients came forward with similar stories, creating a public narrative that validated everything I had documented during my investigation. Dr. Riverside was being exposed not as a misunderstood professional facing false allegations, but as a predator who had systematically exploited her position to harm vulnerable people over a period of years. By Tuesday morning, the story had gained national attention as an example of healthcare fraud and professional misconduct that highlighted the need for stronger oversight of mental health providers. The morning talk shows featured discussions about patient vulnerability, professional boundaries, and the importance of regulatory agencies in protecting public safety from predatory practitioners. Dr. Riverside's attempt to control the narrative through her own media appearances only made her situation worse, as her defensive statements contradicted evidence that was becoming public through court filings and regulatory disclosures. Her claim that the charges were the result of a personal vendetta by disgruntled former patients was undermined by the scope of the federal investigation and the systematic nature of the evidence against her practice. The professional consequences continued to accelerate throughout the week as additional regulatory bodies joined the investigation. The American Psychological Association announced a review of Dr. Riverside's certification, while the Colorado Department of Health began examining her clinic's compliance with state health regulations. The corporate wellness programs that had provided access to high-net-worth patients were being audited for their role in facilitating her fraudulent billing practices. Wednesday brought the announcement that criminal charges would be filed against Dr. Riverside within the month, including healthcare fraud, insurance fraud, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The potential sentences associated with these charges could result in substantial prison time, ensuring that her professional misconduct would have consequences extending far beyond regulatory discipline. Marcus called again on Wednesday evening, his voice carrying a desperation that reflected his growing understanding of how his association with Dr. Riverside would affect his own future. "Amanda, the FBI wants to interview me about my knowledge of Natalie's billing practices and patient relationships. They're asking if I knew about any of her professional misconduct." The federal investigation was expanding to include anyone who might have had knowledge of Dr. Riverside's fraudulent activities, including romantic partners who could have been aware of her methods and chosen to remain silent. Marcus's affair with Dr. Riverside was no longer just a personal betrayal. It was potentially criminal conspiracy if prosecutors could demonstrate that he had knowledge of her illegal activities. "I suggest you obtain competent legal representation immediately," I advised, maintaining the professional tone that had characterized all our conversations since his discovery of my involvement in the investigation. "Your relationship with Dr. Riverside may create legal exposure that extends beyond our personal situation." The revelation that Marcus might face criminal charges for his association with Dr. Riverside added another layer of justice to the situation that had begun with their romantic betrayal. They had used marriage counseling as cover for their affair, exploiting the therapeutic relationship for personal gain while dismissing the harm their actions caused to others. Now both would face consequences that matched the scope of their misconduct. Thursday morning brought the news that Dr. Riverside's medical license had been permanently revoked by an emergency board vote, making her ineligible to practice psychology. In Colorado or any other state that recognized the board's disciplinary actions, the unanimous vote reflected the severity of her misconduct and the comprehensive nature of the evidence supporting the charges against her. The revocation meant that Dr. Riverside's professional life was permanently destroyed, her decade of education and training rendered worthless by her choice to exploit patients for personal gain. The clinic she had built, the reputation she had cultivated, and the future she had planned with Marcus were all casualties of the investigation that had grown from my methodical documentation of her systematic misconduct. Friday afternoon concluded, the most devastating week in Dr. Riverside's professional life, with the announcement that she would be named as a defendant in a class action lawsuit filed by former patients seeking damages for professional misconduct and emotional harm. The lawsuit included testimony from 12 former patients whose experiences with Dr. Riverside's boundary violations demonstrated a pattern of predatory behavior that extended back to the beginning of her independent practice. As I reviewed the week's developments from my office overlooking downtown Denver, I reflected on the transformation that had occurred in all our lives. Dr. Natalie Riverside had entered the week as a successful therapist planning her future with my husband. She was ending it as a disgraced former practitioner facing criminal prosecution and financial ruin. Marcus had begun the week believing he had successfully orchestrated his escape from our marriage. He was ending it facing potential criminal charges and financial devastation. The investigation that had begun with my personal desire for justice had evolved into something far more significant, a comprehensive examination of professional misconduct that would protect countless future patients from similar exploitation. Dr. Riverside's downfall was becoming the foundation for reforms that would strengthen oversight of mental health providers and improve protection for vulnerable patients seeking therapeutic help. The week had demonstrated that institutional power, when properly deployed by someone who understood its mechanisms, could deliver justice that matched the scope of the harm that had been inflicted. Dr. Riverside had underestimated the quiet woman whose marriage she had destroyed, mistaking professional restraint for personal weakness. That miscalculation had cost her everything she had worked to achieve and would define the remainder of her life. 6 months after Dr. Natalie Riverside's professional world imploded in a cascade of criminal charges and regulatory sanctions, I stood before the packed auditorium at the University of Colorado's medical school, delivering the keynote address at their annual conference on professional ethics and patient protection. The irony wasn't lost on me that the woman who had once been a patient seeking marriage counseling was now recognized as a leading advocate for healthcare reform and regulatory oversight. The audience consisted of medical students, practicing physicians, mental health professionals, and regulatory officials from across the Mountain West region, all gathered to discuss the lessons learned from what had become known as the Riverside case. The scandal had reverberated far beyond Colorado's borders, prompting legislative hearings, policy reforms, and new oversight mechanisms designed to prevent similar exploitation of vulnerable patients. The case we'll be examining today demonstrates how professional credentials can be weaponized against the very people they're meant to protect, I began, my voice carrying the authority that came from lived experience rather than academic theory. Dr. Riverside's systematic exploitation of patients reveals critical gaps in our oversight systems that allowed predatory behavior to continue for years. The presentation included detailed analysis of the evidence that had brought down Dr. Riverside's practice, though I carefully avoided mentioning my personal connection to the case. The audience didn't need to know that the comprehensive investigation had been initiated by a betrayed wife seeking justice. They needed to understand how regulatory systems could be strengthened to protect future patients from similar exploitation. The financial fraud alone had been staggering in its scope and sophistication. Federal investigators had traced over $2.8 million in fraudulent insurance claims submitted by Dr. Riverside over a 3-year period, money that had funded her clinic expansion and luxurious lifestyle, while patients received substandard care designed to create dependency rather than healing. The billing scheme had been particularly insidious, using legitimate therapy sessions as cover for what amounted to emotional manipulation and psychological grooming. The intensive breakthrough sessions that Dr. Riverside marketed as cutting-edge treatment were actually extended appointments designed to break down patient boundaries and create inappropriate relationships that served her personal and financial interests. The corporate wellness angle provided perfect cover for targeting vulnerable high-net-worth individuals, I explained to the audience, displaying charts that showed how Dr. Riverside had systematically accessed Denver's professional elite through their employers' mental health benefits. She understood that executives facing marital difficulties would be particularly susceptible to emotional manipulation, especially when that manipulation was disguised as professional therapy. The criminal prosecution had proceeded with devastating efficiency once federal investigators gained access to Dr. Riverside's complete files and financial records. The evidence of systematic fraud was so overwhelming that her defense team had negotiated a plea agreement rather than risk the longer sentences that would have resulted from a trial conviction. Dr. Riverside had been sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation, during which she would be prohibited from any contact with former patients or involvement in healthcare-related activities. The financial restitution ordered by the court exceeded $4 million, ensuring that she would spend decades paying for the harm she had inflicted on patients and insurance systems. But the criminal conviction was only part of the justice that had been delivered. The civil lawsuits filed by former patients had resulted in settlements totaling over $6 million, money that provided tangible compensation for the emotional and psychological harm caused by Dr. Riverside's boundary violations and manipulation tactics. Marcus had faced his own reckoning, though his consequences were primarily financial and personal rather than criminal. The federal investigation had determined that while he had been aware of Dr. Riverside's unconventional methods, he lacked sufficient knowledge of the billing fraud to warrant conspiracy charges. However, his association with her had destroyed his reputation in Denver's business community and resulted in the collapse of several major development projects. The divorce settlement had been particularly satisfying, with the prenuptial agreement he had dismissed as unnecessary becoming the legal framework that protected my assets while leaving him responsible for substantial debts. The court had been especially unsympathetic to his claims for spousal support, given the circumstances that had led to our marriage's dissolution. The personal cost of professional misconduct extends far beyond the immediate victims, I continued, addressing the audience of future healthcare providers. Dr. Riverside's actions damaged not only her patients, but also their families, her colleagues, and the broader community's trust in mental health services. The ripple effects of the case had indeed been profound. 3 other mental health practices in the Denver area had been investigated after patients reported similar billing irregularities and boundary violations, resulting in additional license suspensions and criminal referrals. The corporate wellness programs that had unknowingly facilitated Dr. Riverside's access to victims had implemented new oversight procedures and background checking requirements. Most significantly, the Colorado State Medical Board had revised its complaint procedures and investigation protocols to ensure that patterns of misconduct would be identified more quickly and addressed more aggressively. The reforms included mandatory reporting requirements for insurance irregularities, enhanced background checks for license renewals, and victim advocate programs that provided support for patients filing complaints against healthcare providers. Jennifer Walsh, the marketing executive whose courage in speaking publicly had helped validate the investigation, had become a prominent advocate for healthcare reform and patient rights. She had testified before the state legislature about the need for stronger oversight of mental health providers, and had established a foundation that provided legal support for patients seeking to report professional misconduct. The most important lesson from this case is that institutional power can be a force for justice when properly deployed by people who understand its mechanisms, I told the audience, thinking about the transformation I had undergone from betrayed spouse to regulatory reformer. Healthcare professionals hold positions of extraordinary trust and authority. When that trust is violated, the response must be proportional to the harm that has been inflicted. The question and answer session that followed my presentation revealed the deep concern among healthcare professionals about maintaining public trust while protecting patients from predatory colleagues. Several audience members asked about early warning signs of boundary violations, methods for reporting suspected misconduct, and ways to support patients who had experienced professional exploitation. Dr. Patricia Moore, who had been instrumental in coordinating the investigation, spoke about the board's commitment to preventing similar cases through enhanced oversight and rapid response to complaints. The Riverside case demonstrated that patient protection requires vigilance not just from regulatory agencies, but from the entire healthcare community, she explained. We all have responsibilities to identify and report colleagues whose behavior threatens patient safety. The conference concluded with the announcement of new continuing education requirements focused on professional boundaries and ethical decision-making. Reforms that would ensure future healthcare providers received comprehensive training in recognizing and preventing the types of violations that had characterized Dr. Riverside's practice. As I drove back to Denver through the mountains, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from devastated wife to recognized advocate for healthcare reform. The personal betrayal that had shattered my marriage had been transformed into a force for institutional change that would protect countless future patients from similar exploitation. The Cognitive Liberty Legal Foundation I had established 6 months earlier was now handling dozens of cases involving professional misconduct, coercive control, and institutional exploitation. Our client base included not only healthcare patients but also students, employees, and community members who had been harmed by people in positions of authority. The Foundation's work had attracted national attention and funding from organizations committed to protecting vulnerable populations from systematic exploitation. We had established partnerships with regulatory agencies across multiple states, creating networks that could identify patterns of misconduct that might otherwise go undetected. My personal life had also undergone profound transformation. The pain and betrayal that had initially motivated my investigation of Dr. Riverside had evolved into something far more meaningful. A sense of purpose that came from using my skills and experience to protect others from similar harm. The divorce from Marcus had been finalized 3 months earlier, ending our 8-year marriage with the same efficiency that had characterized my investigation of his lover. He had relocated to Phoenix, attempting to rebuild his business career, away from the Denver market where his association with Dr. Riverside had destroyed his professional reputation. I had chosen to remain in Colorado, finding that my work with the medical board and the legal foundation provided fulfillment that had been missing during my years as a corporate wife. The Cherry Creek penthouse had been sold, with the proceeds funding the foundation's expansion into additional states where similar reforms were needed. The evening news that night featured a follow-up story on the Riverside case, marking the 6-month anniversary of her arrest with interviews from former patients who had found healing through the justice process. The reporter noted that Dr. Riverside was serving her sentence at a federal facility in Texas, where she was participating in programs designed to help inmates understand the impact of their crimes on victims and communities. One former patient, speaking anonymously to protect her privacy, described the relief that had come from seeing Dr. Riverside held accountable for her actions. "For years, I blamed myself for what happened during those therapy sessions," she explained. "Seeing her in prison helped me understand that I was the victim of a crime, not a participant in a therapeutic relationship." The news story concluded with footage from my morning presentation, highlighting the ongoing reforms that had emerged from the case and the broader implications for healthcare oversight and patient protection. The anchor noted that what had begun as a single complaint against one provider had evolved into a model for systematic reform that was being studied and replicated in other states. That night, as I reviewed the Foundation's latest cases and prepared for the week ahead, I thought about Dr. Natalie Riverside serving her sentence in federal prison, far from the Denver clinic where she had exploited vulnerable patients for personal gain. The woman who had destroyed my marriage while positioning herself as a therapeutic expert was now learning firsthand about the consequences of professional misconduct. The justice that had been delivered was both personal and institutional, addressing not only the specific harm she had caused to individual patients, but also the broader threat her behavior had posed to public trust in healthcare systems. Her permanent exclusion from medical practice ensured that she would never again be in a position to exploit vulnerable people seeking help. Marcus, meanwhile, was discovering that his romantic triumph had become a cautionary tale about the risks of associating with unethical professionals. His business reputation in Denver remained damaged beyond repair, forcing him to start over in a new market where his past associations were unknown, but his access to capital and connections was severely limited. The transformation that had occurred in my own life was perhaps the most profound of all. The quiet, analytical woman who had entered marriage counseling seeking to save her relationship had evolved into a recognized expert in institutional reform and patient advocacy. The skills that had made me effective in regulatory oversight had proven equally valuable in delivering justice to those who had underestimated my capabilities. The Foundation's work continued to expand, with new cases arriving weekly from patients, students, and employees who had experienced exploitation by people in positions of authority. Each case provided an opportunity to deploy the same methodical approach that had brought down Dr. Riverside, using institutional power to protect vulnerable people from systematic harm. As I prepared for sleep in my downtown apartment, surrounded by case files and reform proposals, I felt the deep satisfaction that came from transforming personal devastation into meaningful purpose. Dr. Riverside had taught me important lessons about human nature and institutional vulnerability, though not in the way she had intended during our therapy sessions. The woman who had analyzed my psychology while conducting an affair with my husband had failed to understand the most important aspect of my character. When sufficiently motivated, I was capable of patient, methodical, and utterly effective response to betrayal. Her expertise in human behavior had critical blind spots, and those gaps in understanding had cost her everything she had worked to achieve. The legacy of the Riverside case would continue for years to come, protecting future patients from similar exploitation while serving as a reminder that professional credentials could not shield predatory behavior from the consequences of institutional justice. Dr. Riverside's downfall had become the foundation for reforms that would strengthen healthcare oversight and improve protection for vulnerable populations across multiple states. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.